Daniel Dennett's perspective, narrative self, from my book, The Search for Being. A self, according to my theory, said philosopher Daniel Dennett, is not any old mathematical point, but an abstraction defined by the myriads of attributions and interpretations, including self-attributions and self-interpretations, that have composed the biography of the living body, whose center of narrative gravity it is. We define ourselves, Dennett explains, by telling stories to ourselves and others about who we are. It's through narratives, Dennett believes, that we express our experiences to ourselves and others. It is our narratives, Dennett claims, that are the lifeblood of the illusion we call the self. It's not that we sit down and figure out what narratives to tell others, Dennett said, but rather that our selfhood is the product of the stories we tell. The self is a fiction, Dennett said, created by, well, not by me, but by my brain, acting in concert over the years with my parents and siblings and friends. It's our web of beliefs that make up our self, said Dennett. We have the dualistic notion, Dennett maintains, that the self is distinct from our brain or body. But the self is not our boss, Dennett said, not an internal observer who drives the machine. It is our brain, he contends, that generates self-representations. Rather than learning about ourselves through introspection, we learn about ourselves much as other observers learn about us. We tell stories about ourselves, and then we check to see if our stories are true. The self is thus, said Dennett, a construction created by the brain out of a web of words and deeds. It's brain processes, Dennett said, that do the thinking. Dennett advises us not to think of the self as something with beliefs and desires, but rather to see the self as beliefs and desires. Thus, the self is something that comes into existence slowly, as one says, I believe this, I desire this, as one acquires beliefs and desires that come together in a coherent narrative. What you are, Dennett said, is that agent whose life you can tell about. Dennett takes the materialist position that matter is the one stuff things are made of. He disputes the idea of the self as an essence that constitutes a person's identity. We have a biological self, said Dennett. The biological self, he said, is the principle of organization. He describes it as a minimal proclivity to distinguish self from other in order to protect oneself. We have a need for self-knowledge. Dennett tells us we need to know about our internal states, tendencies, decisions, strengths, and weaknesses. And the way we find out about them is to look and observe ourselves. But the important thing in Dennett's theory is that we are almost constantly engaged in presenting ourselves to others and to ourselves, and hence representing ourselves in language and gesture, external and internal. We weave words, he tells us, into self-protective strings of narrative. Dennett describes words as meme vehicles. They tend to take over creating us, he said, out of the raw materials they find in our brains. Dennett defines memes as units of imitation or cultural transmission. Social creatures, ourselves, are partially constructed on the basis of memes. Through imitation, memes or ideas are replicated in our brains. They contribute to the construction of our minds. Among the places we imbibe memes are from books or sayings or pictures. Thousands of memes, said Dennett, mostly born by language, but also by wordless images and other data structures, take up residence in an individual brain, shaping its tendencies and thereby turning it into a mind. Thus, he contends, we do not typically choose the stuff out of which our minds are made. Memes are the cultural equivalent of genes. They are passed from one mind to another and are the stuff out of which cultures are built. The most entrenched aspects of our minds are the memes for normative concepts for ought and good and truth and beauty. These memes, said Dennett, play a central role in our constitutions. Our survival derives from our better-than-chance habit of choosing the memes that help us, said Dennett, from the many different cultures that make up our environment. Thus, Dennett does not see us as a directionless assembly of cells who formulate goals solely on our own. Rather, our minds are the result, he believes, of natural selection and cultural evolution. We are born with genetic goals as a result of natural selection, for instance, the need to keep warm, to find food, to stay near our mothers, all in the service of propagating our species, he said. Evolution embodies information in every part of the organism, said Dennett. The components of our minds are sometimes the product of billions of years of evolution. We can become aware of our pre-programmed goals, and once we are aware of them, said Dennett, we can modify them. In this way, human beings do not have to follow biological goals, but it is natural selection that can provide us with some of the reasons for what we do. We can look at our behavior in terms of Darwinian reasons, said Dennett, and ask what is the survival value of what we do. Our beliefs are the product, said Dennett, of our evolutionary history, our experience, and the way our brains work. One way we can explain things is by using the design stance. In Dennett's materialistic scheme of things, the evolutionary process is man's design developer. We can use the design stance, said Dennett, to understand how something was designed to behave. We can also explain things, Dennett said, by using the physical stance. We use the physical stance to describe causal processes and how something is built. Or we can try to understand ourselves or others by using the intentional stance, said Dennett. We use the intentional stance when we look at a system's goals and observe what it is trying to do and how it is trying to do it. The only way we have of judging our behavior, as well as the behavior of others, said Dennett, is to see it in terms of goals and beliefs and desires. We use the intentional stance when we want to predict or interpret the behavior of others. When we talk about what another thinks, believes, or desires, what we are really doing is trying to predict or control the behavior of the other, according to Dennett. The interest of the person doing the predicting or controlling is always a factor in his behavior, Dennett maintains. We can predict the behavior of systems, said Dennett, by determining what would be rational for that machine or organism to do. Rationality, says Dennett, means doing what is good for us and responding appropriately in our environment. Our behavior is made of acts, said Dennett, that are rational given our beliefs and desires. A rational being desires the good. Thus, Dennett's theory seeks to explain human intentionality and agency by seeing the source of intentionality in Darwinian processes. Even the first self-replicating macromolecules, Dennett tells us, had reasons for their behavior, even though they were unaware of what those reasons were. Dennett goes on to explain how consciousness evolved. Our conscious minds, he tells us, evolved from 3 evolutionary processes. In the beginning of consciousness, there was no planning, just approach or withdrawal behavior, depending on the nature of the stimuli. Next, anticipation was hardwired in, and as Dennett describes it, the ability to duck developed. During the third stage of evolution, the system could visually analyze if the stimuli was friend or foe or food. Possessed of orienting responses, episodes of heightened vigilance would interrupt normal responses of autopilot, where the organism operated at less than its full capacity, he said. This state of vigilance turned into exploratory behavior, where information was gathered which might one day be useful. What Dennett calls epistemic hunger, or the birth of our curiosity, gradually evolved from vigilance, where we gathered information about ourselves and our environment. Dennett sees our brains as information processing systems. There is no central headquarters, no place where everything comes together, he says. Rather, there are multiple channels in which specialist circuits in the brain try in parallel pandemoniums to do their various things, creating multiple drafts as they go, said Dennett. There is no single stream of consciousness, he emphasizes. To understand what we say and do, said Dennett, we have to understand the multiple drafts model of consciousness. In place of what has been termed the ghost in the machine, the idea a mind exists controlling the body, or the idea of a central witness, Dennett uses the metaphor of a virtual machine to describe what a person is. Our minds, he tells us, are like virtual machines in which mental activity happens. We aren't the authors of our mental processes, he said. Rather, we are the recipients of its results. All our perceptions, our thoughts, our mental activities, he said, happen in parallel multi-track processes of interpretation and elaboration of sensory inputs. Localized portions of our brain, he explained, fix information that is observed in what he calls content fixations. These distributed content discriminations yield, over the course of time, something rather like a narrative stream or sequence which can be thought of as subject to continual editing by many processes distributed around in the brain and continuing indefinitely into the future. This stream of contents is only rather, he said, like a narrative. Because of its multiplicity, at any point in time there are multiple drafts of narrative fragments at various stages of editing in various places in the brain. Thus, he sees our mind as consisting of many fragments of narratives in various stages of revision. There is no one final single narrative that constitutes our actual stream of consciousness, he said. There is not one, but many voices within us, he believes. His model is one of contents arising, getting revised, contributing to the interpretation of other contents, or modulating our verbal or physical behavior, and leaving traces in memory which are either incorporated or decay. Our network of beliefs and desires change as new stimuli, new beliefs and desires are acquired. The information that enters our nervous system, Dennett said, is continuously being revised. We have points of view, he tells us, as conscious subjects derived from the information available to us at a particular point moving through space-time. The executive functions which others tell us the self performs, Dennett says the brain performs. Our minds, he tells us, are in our brains. He calls our brains anticipation machines that track and anticipate features in our environment. It mines the present for clues, which it refines with the help of the materials it has saved from the past, turning them into anticipations of the future, said Dennett. Our brains do not contain, he emphasizes, a central point. Mental contents become conscious, believes Dennett, not by entering some special chamber in the brain, not by being transduced into some privileged and mysterious medium, but by winning the competitions against other mental contents for domination in the control of behavior, and hence for achieving long-lasting effects, or as we misleadingly say, entering our memory, said Dennett. Competitive processes, he said, go on in the brain, and what is conscious has won the competition. How things seem to you, Dennett believed, is a judgment based on your history and the content you are in. And the context you are in. I'm going to reread that because it goes along with what the intersubjective psychoanalyst says, and also the interpersonal psychoanalyst. So it's very important. All right, let's read that again. How things seem to you, Dennett believed, is a judgment based on your history and the context you are in. The intersubjectivists say the interpersonal context you are in, the environments, the people who make up your environment. What makes us different from animals, Dennett said, is that our human environment is filled with words. Language frees us from learning everything on our own through trial and error. It allows the lessons of the past to be passed down to us. Our kind of mind is possible, Dennett said, because we have language. With language comes labels for states we observe in ourselves and for understanding our world. Language is central, Dennett contended, to the development of morally responsible agency. For Dennett, it's our expressing something that makes it what it is for us.